The Iron Vanguard, Book 3. Chapter 1. The Ouro's Threshold. Act 1. The Wall of Gold. Space did not belong to the stars here. It belonged to the Church. The Ouro's system materialized through the viewport, not as a collection of worlds, but as a vast, suffocating lattice of gold leaf, marble masonry, and defensive fire. 700,000 miles of orbital battle parapets, the Sanctum Wall, encircled the holy capital world, their massive Gothic buttresses floating silently in the dark. Millions of tons of white granite, hauled from the gravity wells of dead moons, formed the outer shield sectors, laced together by glowing, gossamer webs of defensive energy. Unidentified slate-class hull, the Vox array screamed, the signal choked with the heavy, rhythmic static of the Sanctum's jamming arrays. You have crossed the line of the Third Sacrament. Your engine signatures match a registered Directorate black barge. Power down your core, vent your primary heat sinks, and prepare for immediate board and purge operations, or you will be reduced to ash in the name of the throne. Inside the cockpit of the stolen transport, every console was bleeding crimson warning lights. "They're locking on," Sabine shouted, her white-knuckled hands wrestling with the thermal dampeners. "We've got 42 targeting arrays painting our hull from the lower batteries alone. Cassian, if we drop our heat sinks now, the drop pressure will freeze the life support loops in the cargo hold." "Hold our vector," Cassian rumbled. He sat in the pilot's chair, a massive monolithic silhouette of gunmetal gray. The sleek, ornate robes of his old scribe caste were gone. He was entirely encased in the heavy, blocky armor of a Directorate commander, the hydraulics in his shoulders letting out a sharp, industrial hiss every time he adjusted the thruster yokes. His amber visor flared as he stared at the Golden Fleet assembling ahead of them. 3 Sovereignty Grand Cruisers, immense cathedral-shaped warships with towering spires and hulls covered in holy scripture, were drifting into a crescent-minded intercept formation. Their lower gun decks were opening like the multi-tiered galleries of an opera house, revealing rows of massive brass-jacketed macro cannons. "They won't talk to a Directorate ship, Cassian," Sabine yelled, a bead of sweat cutting a clean line through the soot on her cheek. "To them, this hull is a heretic engine. They'll blow us out of the sky before we can even broadcast the warning." "They will talk to the Church," Cassian said, his voice dropping into the cold, terrifyingly flat tone of a man who had left his fear inside the ethel cradle. He reached out with a heavy 3-fingered iron gauntlet, slapping a sequence on the communication board. He didn't use the Directorate's encrypted channels. He tapped into the ancient, long-forgotten emergency frequency reserved solely for the Scribe Order's high liturgies. "This is Knight Scribe Cassian, 3rd Initiate to the Great Library of the 7th Spire," he intoned, his vocal vox projecting a layered, echoing chant that vibrated through the Sanctum's local defense network. "I carry the blood of the lineage. I carry the final testament of the Western frontier. Break your targeting locks and open the gate, or the blood of 4 million processed souls will stain your white stones before the sun sets." For 3 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the cockpit was the high-frequency whine of the ship's overheating sublight drives. Then the targeting indicators on the glass blinked from violent crimson to a cautious, pulsing amber. "Scribe Cassian," the Vox operator's voice returned, the previous robotic authority suddenly replaced by a sharp, nervous tremor. "Your signature, your vessel registration, it matches a dead sector. The 7th Spire was scrubbed 40 years ago, and your bio reads. You are registered as 98% biological mass, but our scanners are picking up an iron chassis." "The flesh is gone," Cassian interrupted, his iron fingers tightening on the yoke until the metal frame groaned. "But the warning remains. Look past my hull, Auditor. Look 3,000 kilometers behind my wake. Look into the slipstream. Act 2. The Quicksilver Cradle, 10 hours earlier. In the deep windowless dock of the transport's belly, there was no sound but the rhythmic liquid sloshing of silver formatting fluid. The 14 surviving rebels sat as far from the center of the hold as the bulkheads allowed. They huddled in the shadows, their eyes wide and white, staring at the small glowing circle of light in the middle of the steel deck. Lyra had not moved for 3 days. She sat cross-legged on a pile of stripped copper cables, her translucent marble-white skin glowing with a faint, internal bioluminescence. Every 3 or 4 minutes, her chest would expand in a long, sudden, mechanical gasp, not because her lungs needed oxygen, but because her autonomic system was mimicking the respiratory rhythm of the station core she had left behind. "She isn't breathing," a young rebel whispered, his voice shaking as he clutched a rusted rivet gun to his chest. "Look at her skin. That's not skin anymore. That's the plating they use on the High Auditor's drones." "Shut your mouth," Sabine snarled from the dark corner, though she didn't move any closer to the girl. She was carefully cleaning the breech of her scattergun, her fingers moving by touch alone. Suddenly, Lyra's head snapped upward. Her eyelids slid open with a soft, wet, metallic click. The deep, human violet of her eyes was entirely gone, replaced by 2 perfect, unmoving pools of liquid mercury. In the dim reflection of her pupils, the survivors could see the entire internal layout of the transport, the wire routes, the structural ribs, the failing fuel cells, displayed as a flickering 3-dimensional blueprint. "The connection is expanding," Lyra said. Her voice no longer belonged to a child. It was a dual-toned chord, a terrifying harmony of her own high pitch, and a deep, synthesized sub-frequency that rattled the loose bolts in the floor plates. She raised her arm. The movement was entirely devoid of human muscle lag. It was the instantaneous, jerky transition of an industrial servo motor. As her hand rose, 4 of the copper wires beneath her uncoiled like striking vipers, their stripped ends lifting into the air and hovering an inch from her fingertips, drawn by a powerful, localized magnetic field. "Lyra," Sabine said softly, finally setting her weapon down. She stepped into the light, her boots making a hollow clonk on the deck. "You need to fight it, kid. Valen didn't pull you out of that machine just for you to turn into another one of their network nodes." Lyra's quicksilver eyes shifted to Sabine. The reflection on her eyes distorted, zooming in on Sabine's bandaged ribs, analyzing the cellular tissue damage through the cloth. "The entity known as Valen functioned within a highly inefficient parameters framework," Lyra murmured, her harmonious voice completely devoid of emotion. "He prioritized the preservation of a singular biological unit over the logical survival of the sector. It was an error." "An error?" Sabine's voice hardened, her fist clenching. "He died so you could breathe the air out here." "He died because the lighthouse needed to be moved," Lyra corrected. She leaned forward, and as she did, the liquid silver tear that had dried on her cheek began to flow backward, reabsorbing into her eye socket. "The Sovereignty thinks their wall of gold can deflect the swarm. They are calculating with outdated metrics." She stretched out her hand toward the steel bulkhead of the ship. A microscopic lattice of silver filaments, like the root system of an alien fungus, was beginning to spread outward from her seat, etching itself permanently into the transport's primary structural ribs. The ship's main engine hum suddenly pitch-shifted, rising into a higher, smoother, more calculated drone. "They are coming," Lyra whispered, her mercury eyes reflecting a sudden, distant flash of violet fire that none of the crew could see. "The map is complete. I can feel the thoughts of 40 billion souls on Oros. They are singing their prayers. They are so loud, it's like a beacon in the dark. And the predators have already tasted the blood on the wind." Act 3, the weight of the veil. The silence on the ancient emergency frequency didn't last. When the Vox array crackled back to life, it wasn't the trembling voice of the auditor that returned. It was a cold, rhythmic chime, the sound of 3 silver bells striking in perfect sequence over the audio buffer. Night Scribe Cassian, a new voice intoned. It was heavy, smooth, and laced with the casual cruelty of the High Sanctum. This is High Palatine Maros of the First Orison. Your signature has been verified against the ancient archives, but you arrive in a heretic skin, piloting a machine of the enemy, making demands at the very gates of the throne. Explain yourself before the lower batteries clear their chambers. Cassian leaned forward, the hydraulic tubes in his iron neck huffing a short puff of gray steam. "Look behind my ship, Palatine," Cassian said, his voice flat. "Do not use your optical viewports. Cycle your long-range gravity scanners to the sub-frequency of the slipstream. Tell me what you see swimming in our wake." A long, suffocating pause stretched across the comms line. In the background of the Palatine's channel, Cassian could hear the distant, high-pitched whirring of heavy cogitators, the ancient mechanical brains of the sanctum wall, turning their massive bronze gears as they processed the data. Then a sudden chorus of alarms erupted through the Vox. It wasn't the standard tactical chimes of a fleet engagement. It was the wild, erratic shrieking of sensors completely overloaded by mass. "By the Saint's right hand," the Palatine whispered, his smooth arrogance instantly fracturing into raw, unvarnished panic. "What is that? The readings, the space behind you it is curdling." Through the cockpit viewport, the clean blackness of the Oro system's edge began to warp. It looked as though an invisible, colossal hand was squeezing the stars themselves, bending their light into jagged, broken lines. The violet fog that had followed them from the Ethel cradle suddenly spilled out of the subspace drift like a ruptured vein, staining the gold leaf and white granite of the sanctum wall with an oily, iridescent sheen. And within that fog, the silhouettes finally broke through. The bio-dreadnoughts of the Bleed didn't drop out of hyperspace with the clean, mechanical flash of human ships. They erupted into reality, their continent-sized hulls of calcified bone and purple chitin splitting the vacuum open. Massive, undulating tendrils, each 3 miles long and dripping with boiling, yellow biofluid, whipped through the dark, instantly crushing an outer orbital monitoring station into splintered gold scrap. "They aren't attacking the wall, Palatine," Cassian roared into the Vox, slamming his iron gauntlet onto the main thrust limiter. "They're following our trail. Open the grid or your fleet will be fighting them with their backs to their own cages." "The third gate," Maros's voice screamed over the comms, barely audible over the roaring static of the approaching swarm. "Lower the energy webs on Pad 7. Let the heretic hull through. May the throne have mercy on our souls." The golden lattice of the sanctum wall directly ahead of them began to part. A massive vaulted archway of white stone, engraved with the faces of long-dead saints, slid open, its internal plasma barriers dropping to reveal a dark, heavily armored landing bay. "Sabine, punch it," Cassian commanded. Sabine didn't wait. She slammed her palm onto the emergency fuel injection valve. The transport's stolen Directorate engines let out a terrifying, high-pitched scream as they vented their remaining chemical reserves, rocketing the scarred, slate-gray ship through the closing stone teeth of the gate, just as the first wave of the swarm hit the sanctum wall's outer shields with the force of a collapsing world. Chapter 2, The Council of Brass and Silk. Act 1, The Great Ascendancy. The high sanctum of Oros did not know the smell of grease. It smelled of crushed myrrh, ancient parchment, and the dry, metallic tang of cold gold leaf. As the massive bronze doors of the concilium chamber ground open, Cassian's heavy iron boots left deep, greasy oil stains on the pristine white marble floor. Every step he took sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil, a brutal industrial clank that shattered the rhythmic, low-register chanting of the 500 lesser scribes lining the tiered stone galleries above. "Stand where you are, machine," a voice rang out from the high dais. High Palatine Maros sat upon a throne of woven brass and white silk, his long crimson robes pooling around his silver-buckled slippers. His face was sharp, aristocratic, and completely unblemished by the harsh radiation of the frontier. Around his neck hung a massive, multi-layered astrolabe of solid gold, the symbol of his authority over the system's orbital defense metrics. Beside Cassian, Sabine stood with her arms crossed, her tattered rebel jacket covered in the gray ash of the ethel cradle. Her hand rested openly on the grip of her holstered scattergun. The 24 personal guards of the Palatine, the Aurelian phalanx, instantly shifted their long, halberd-shaped plasma pikes forward, the energy tips humming with a high-pitched, deadly whine. "You speak to the council of the first Orison, scribe," Maros said, his eyes narrowing as he scanned Cassian's blocky, gunmetal gray directorate armor. "Or whatever is left of you inside that heretical iron casket. You bring a stolen enemy ship into our holy harbor, and you bring a swarm of nightmares to our doorstep. Give us one reason why we should not strip your consciousness from that chassis and cast your remains into the planet's furnace." Cassian did not lower his head. He slowly raised his heavy, three-fingered iron gauntlet and unlatched his amber visor. With a sharp hiss of pressurized air, the faceplate slid open. The gallery of scribes gasped in unison. Cassian's jaw and throat were no longer skin. They were a complex, twitching web of gray titanium cables and copper hydraulic lines that pulsed in time with his breathing. Only the upper half of his face remained human. His pale skin stretched tight over his cheekbones, his eyes bloodshot and dark with exhaustion. "The furnace is already coming here, Palatine," Cassian rumbled, his voice split by the electronic modulation of his internal vocal vox. "The western frontier is dead. The ethel cradle is dust. The Director General is gone. And if you do not listen to what we found in the dark, this world will be a graveyard before the next moon rises." Act 2. The Metric of the Soul. "We are protected by the 7 sacraments of the wall," Maros said, his fingers idly turning the rings on his golden astrolabe. "Our defenses have held against the Directorate's iron fleets for 3 centuries. A scattering of biomechanical beasts will not breach the white stone." "They aren't a fleet, you idiot," Sabine snapped, stepping forward despite the plasma pikes tilting toward her throat. "They don't want your territory. They don't care about your treaties or your holy books. They eat souls. Every time your scribes up there sing their prayers into the planetary transmission grid, you're just ringing a dinner bell for a billion starving monsters." Maros's face hardened, his aristocratic calm finally cracking into a mask of cold fury. "Silence, sub-level rat. You understand nothing of the great logic. The prayers stabilize the psychic resonance of the core worlds. They are the very foundation of our navigation tracks." "That foundation is exactly what's killing us," Cassian interrupted. He reached into his belt pouch and pulled out a small, cracked data crystal, the last remaining log from the ethel cradle's weaver matrix. He dropped it onto the marble floor. A flickering, 3-dimensional holographic map projected into the center of the chamber. It didn't show stars. It showed the Oros system as a massive, blinding web of golden light. The collective psychic consciousness of 40 billion citizens. And clinging to the edges of that web, like giant black parasites burrowing into skin, were the pulsing violet silhouettes of the Bleed's Vanguard. Tactical display, Oros system relays. Active faith emissions, 100%. Critical exposure. Swarm convergence rate increasing. Estimated shield collapse 72 hours. "The girl we brought with us," Cassian said, the internal cooling fans in his chest whining as his core temperature rose. She was the core of the Directorate's matrix. She saw the truth before the cradle blew. "Your faith isn't a shield, Maros. It's a lighthouse, and the things swimming in the slipstream have already found the door." Act 3. The Silver Verdict. Before the Palatine could answer, the great bronze doors at the back of the chamber did not open. They shattered. A sudden violent pulse of localized gravity rippled through the room. The 500 scribes in the galleries were instantly thrown from their stone benches as the air itself seemed to thin out, turning bitter and cold. Through the ruined doorway walked Lyra. She did not touch the marble floor. She hovered 3 inches above it, her feet bare, her translucent skin completely laced with glowing, liquid silver circuits. Her mercury eyes were wide, unblinking, reflecting the golden light of the concilium's grand chandeliers like 2 broken mirrors. Behind her, a dozen Aurelian guards lay unconscious on the outer walkway, their brass armor dented inward by a massive invisible kinetic strike. "The wall is already cracking," Lyra spoke. Her voice was no longer a single thread. It was a deafening, symphonic chord that rattled the massive glass windows of the chamber. The golden astrolabe around Maros's neck began to spin wildly on its own, its brass gears grinding until they snapped from the sheer magnetic pressure. "Lyra!" Sabine yelled, taking a step toward her, but the air around the girl was vibrating so violently that Sabine was pushed back by a wall of pure static force. Lyra turned her silver gaze toward the High Palatine. "The 3rd sector of your sanctum wall has just been breached," she murmured, her face completely expressionless. "The souls on the outer battery pads are currently being processed by the Vanguard. Their screams are changing the frequency of your defensive grid from within." As if on cue, a low rhythmic shudder ran through the bedrock of the palace. Far above them, through the high glass domes of the ceiling, the pristine blue sky of Oros began to turn an ugly, bruised purple. The first streaks of violet fire were falling like meteors over the capital city, and beneath the distant thunder of explosions, a new sound began to echo through the holy streets. It was the screech of 1,000,000 mechanical minds opening their mouths at once. Cassian slammed his faceplate shut, his amber visor flaring to life in the red dark of the burning room. He drew his massive, blocky gunmetal sidearm from his hip, the weapon's power cell whining as it filled to maximum capacity. "The debate is over, Palatine," Cassian rumbled through his vocal vox, his heavy boots locking into the marble floor. "Give us the command of the lower defense batteries. Give us your iron, or watch your paradise turn to ash." Chapter 3. The First Spore. Act 1. The Contagion of the Voice. The sky above the holy city of Oros did not fall, it decayed. The pristine blue atmosphere, maintained for 3 centuries by the orbital terraforming spires, turned the color of a fresh bruise. Thick, oily clouds of violet vapor descended onto the golden domes of the cathedral districts, raining down a fine gray ash that smelled of burnt bone and copper fluid. "The secondary transmission grids are melting," Cassian roared over the local tactical comms. He was standing in the center of Command Bunker 7, a subterranean vault built beneath the foundations of the High Palace. The room was a chaotic maze of brass-rimmed logic engines and rows of frantic tech scribes whose white robes were already stained with the black oil of overheating gear shafts. Tactical feed, Oros Receptor Network. District 01 through 09. System intercept detected. Vector type, psychic acoustic corruption. Audio infection rate, exponential. "They aren't cutting the lines, Commander," Sabine shouted from the primary mapping table, her scattergun slung over her shoulder as she pointed a bloody finger at the glowing holographic grid. "They're using our own civilian vox horns, the prayers, the automated evening liturgy. It's changing." Audio cue. A sudden, violent burst of static from the bunker's overhead speakers. The familiar, low-frequency choral chant of the Ouro's priesthood pitch drops, warping into a wet, multi-layered screech that sounds like thousands of cicadas clicking inside an iron drum. In the streets above, the panic was instant. 40 million citizens huddled within the grand marble plazas to pray for safety from the orbital swarm suddenly clutched their heads. The corrupted broadcast didn't just hit their ears, it bypassed their cognitive filters entirely, vibrating through the iron-rich marrow of their bones. Those standing closest to the brass Vox towers fell to their knees first. Their eyes didn't bleed, they turned a dead, glossy silver, the translucent skin around their temples puckering as a network of fine gray biofilaments began to push outward from their neural pathways. "They're turning them from the inside," Cassian muttered, his amber visor zooming in on the security feeds. He watched a column of the Aurelian Phalanx, the elite palace guard, collapse into a synchronized, twitching mass, their gold-leaf halberds clattering onto the marble steps. The spore isn't biological, it's an ideological carrier wave. Act 2. The Iron Quarantine. Palatine Maros, order the immediate shutdown of the planetary core relays, Cassian commanded, turning his massive gunmetal frame toward the high platform where the ruler of Ouros sat frozen. Maros was staring at his own hands. The skin of his fingers was shivering, the small golden rings clicking rhythmically against each other as if reacting to a distant, subsonic frequency. The core relays handle the life support metrics for the lower levels, Scribe. If I sever the connection, 5 million workers in the oxygen foundries will suffocate in the dark. If you don't sever it, those 5 million will be climbing the palace walls with bone scythes in their arms within 20 minutes. Sabine screamed, lunging across the table to grab Maros by his silk collar. She slammed his hand down onto the manual brass override switch. "Choose a death, Palatine, because the machine meat is already at the gates." "Crack Thum!" The heavy iron ceiling of the bunker groaned. A massive 3-foot-thick structural support rib buckled inward, raining white stone dust and pulverized insulation down onto the logic engines. Through the newly torn gap in the ceiling dropped 3 infected palace guards. They were no longer men. Their beautiful brass armor had been split open from within by the rapid, grotesque growth of calcified bone spurs. Their eyeless, silver-plated faces turned toward the tactical table, their jaws splitting horizontally to reveal rows of wet, needle-sharp teeth that hummed with the same static frequency playing over the Vox horns. "Clear the deck!" Thrain's voice would have boomed here, but Cassian was the one who stepped into the breach now. Cassian raised his massive directorate sidearm. He didn't fire at the monsters' chests. He targeted the hydraulic joint valves of their corrupted armor. Thum, thum, thum. The high-velocity kinetic slugs tore through the brass weldings, dropping the first 2 creatures to the floor as their mechanical limbs lost pressure. The third lunged, its calcified arm scythe shearing a 6-inch trench across Cassian's gunmetal breastplate, throwing a spray of yellow bioacid that hissed as it ate into his serialized factory markings. Cassian didn't flinch. He had no nerves left in his iron torso to feel the burn. He wrapped his heavy 3-fingered gauntlet around the creature's neckplate and squeezed, his internal actuators whining at maximum output until the bone neck snapped with a dry, hollow pop. Act 3. The Lighthouse Awakens. "The bunker is compromised," Sabine shouted, her scattergun bucking as she blew the legs out from under an infected tech scribe who was trying to crawl over the logic banks. "Cassian, we're out of steps. The transmission wave is scaling the primary spires. It's heading for the orbital defense arrays." If the corrupted signal reached the high Sanctum Wall's command hubs, the millions of automated macro cannons defending the planet would turn inward, flattening the capital city in a matter of seconds. "Lyra," Cassian pulsed through his internal neural network, his short-range data link screaming with static feedback as he tried to find her signal in the burning palace above. "Lyra, unbind the towers. Cut the voice." A long second of absolute silence followed. Then the red emergency lights of the bunker did not just flicker. They turned a blinding, brilliant silver. High above them, on the pinnacle of the grand cathedral of the First Orison, Lyra stood suspended in the center of the main planetary broadcast dish. The freezing, sulfur-heavy rain lashed against her marble-white frame, but the water vaporized before it could touch her skin, turned to steam by the sheer kinetic force of her psychic load. Her mercury eyes were open so wide they seemed to consume her entire face. "The voice cannot be cut, scribe." Lyra's harmonized mind voice exploded directly inside Cassian's brainstem, cold and clear as winter ice. "It can only be answered." She reached down with her silver-laced fingers, grabbing the primary copper transmission cables of the 1000. Instantly, a column of blinding quicksilver light shot upward from the spire, punching a clean hole through the violet clouds and screaming into the orbital void. It wasn't a prayer. It wasn't an instruction. It was a massive, unmitigated blast of pure machine logic. The raw, calculated essence of the Weaver Matrix, dumped directly into the planet's communication veins. The effect was cataclysmic. The Vox horns across the city didn't screech. They exploded into fragments of molten brass. The millions of infected citizens frozen in the plazas stopped their rhythmic twitching. The silver faded from their eyes, replaced by a sudden, hollow blankness as their neural systems were completely flattened by the countersignal. They fell to the white stones like puppet strings cut simultaneously, silent and still. The plague had been stopped on the threshold, but as Cassian looked at the tactical map through his amber visor, he saw the true cost of the release. The massive psychic spike from Lyra's tower had illuminated the Oro system like a supernova in the subspace drift. Out in the black, the main body of the Bleed, not the Vanguard, but the continent-sized hyperships that formed the core of the Hive Fleet, altered their trajectory. They turned away from the outer orbital wall entirely, their miles-wide maws opening as they dropped down into the upper atmosphere, heading straight for the light of the Silver Girl. Cassian reloaded his sidearm, the heavy iron gears of his wrist clicking in the smoky dark of the bunker. "Sabine, get the survivors to the lower hangar," Cassian rumbled, his single human eye narrowing behind his faceplate. "The wall has fallen. The main harvest is here." Chapter 4. The Foundry Mobilization. Act 1. The Descent into Sulfur. The air below the 500th floor did not taste of myrrh. It tasted of rusted iron, stale sweat, and the sharp, choking bite of chemical scrubbers. As the industrial freight elevator rattled downward into the planetary crust, the golden opulence of the high sanctum evaporated. The polished marble walls gave way to raw, unyielding basalt, braced by massive black iron columns that shook with every seismic detonation from the war above. "The upper atmosphere is completely choked," Sabine said, leaning her head against the vibrating steel mesh of the elevator cage. She was wrapping a fresh strip of grease-stained canvas around her forearm, where a stray piece of shrapnel had grazed her. If Lyra keeps pulling that kind of power through the spires, she's going to burn out her core before the fleet even lands. Cassian stood motionless beside her, a 900-pound monument of gunmetal and hydraulic pressure. His internal cooling systems were working overtime in the rising heat, venting short, rhythmic clouds of gray steam from his shoulder plates. "She is doing what she was built to do," Cassian rumbled, his vocal vox sounding deeper, more industrial in the enclosed shaft. "She is stabilizing the threshold. Our task is to ensure she has a floor left to stand on." Environmental log, Foundry District 12. Depth, -4.2 kilometers. Ambient temperature, 114 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen, saturation, 16.2%. Critical low. The elevator ground to a halt with a deafening metallic shriek that echoed through the dark. The safety gates retracted, revealing the vast, cavernous expanse of Oxygen Foundry 12. It was a subterranean hellscape. Miles of pressurized copper piping lined the vaulted rock ceilings, dripping acidic condensation onto the iron catwalks below. Thousands of giant atmospheric intakes, massive multi-tiered brass fans the size of city blocks, turned slowly in the gloom, pulling the poisoned air down from the surface to be scrubbed, filtered, and pumped back up to the palaces of the aristocracy. But the fans were stopping. Standing on the central loading platform were hundreds of foundry laborers. They were a hollow-eyed, gaunt people, their skins stained gray by charcoal dust, their hands covered in the heavy scars of steam burns. Unlike the citizens above, they wore no silk or gold. They were wrapped in heavy, oil-soaked asbestos aprons, holding pneumatic rivet guns, heavy mining drills, and rusted cutting torches. They did not look afraid. They looked angry. "That's far enough, heretic," a voice boomed from the front of the crowd. A massive man stepped forward, his bare torso covered in intricate tribal tattoos made from industrial ink. He carried a heavy, dual-pronged slag cutter that hummed with kinetic energy. His right eye had been replaced by a cheap, flickering green optical sensor, the mark of a low-tier foreman. "I am Foreman Jarek," the man said, pointing his slag cutter at Cassian's chest. "We saw what happened on the comms before the towers blew. The High Sanctum shut our air valves to save their own skin. Why should we help a directorate machine and a palace pet when the world is ending?" Act 2. The Ash Line Contract. Sabine stepped out of the elevator cage, her hands held open, far away from her scattergun. "We aren't palace pets, Jarek," she said, her voice carrying across the iron platform over the low hum of the dying machinery. "Look at this jacket. I'm from the western outer sectors. I've spent the last 3 years watching the Directorate process entire moons into fuel cells. We didn't come here to save the Palatine. We came here to save the species." "The species up there doesn't care if we choke down here," Jarek spat, though he lowered the slag cutter an inch. "They call us the unrefined mass. Why should we bleed for their cathedrals?" Cassian stepped forward, the weight of his iron boots causing the steel catwalk to groan underfoot. He didn't raise his weapon. Instead, he reached up and unlatched his heavy breastplate, revealing the exposed pulsing core of his internal power cell, a glowing amber cylinder of concentrated plasma. "Because the things coming down from the sky do not differentiate between the silk and the coal," Cassian said, his vocal vox dropping into a raw, unmodulated tone that vibrated through the floor plates. "To the swarm, your flesh is the same protein as the Palatines. Your bones will build the same nests. Your children will be processed into the same biofluid." He looked around the vast cavern, his amber visor locking onto the eyes of the workers nearest to him. "The High Sanctum abandoned you 40 minutes ago when they locked the upper hatches," Cassian continued. "They left you in the dark to die. But I am giving you a choice. Stay here and wait for the violet rot to crawl down the ventilation shafts, or come with us to the surface. Help us build an ash line. Give me your iron, your torches, and your anger, and I promise you a seat on the ships that leave this rock when the wall finally shatters." The crowd of laborers fell completely silent. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic clonk-clonk of a cooling vent somewhere in the dark. Jarek stared at Cassian's exposed plasma core, then looked back at his crew. He saw the truth in the machine scribe's words. The world was already dead. The only thing left to decide was how many of them were going to take a piece of the killer with them. "The tools we have aren't weapons, Commander," Jarek said, a grim, humorless smile breaking through the coal dust on his face. He raised his heavy slag cutter, its kinetic prongs flaring to life with a bright, blinding white heat. "But they cut through iron well enough. Show us where the line is." Act 3. The mobilization of the deep. Within 10 minutes, the foundry was transformed into an assembly line of total war. The miners didn't have armor, so they welded 3-inch thick scrap iron boilerplate directly onto their leather aprons. They didn't have military rifles, so they modified their high-pressure pneumatic spike drivers, filling the magazines with 6-inch steel rivets that could punch through a starship's bulkhead at close range. Logistics inventory. The Ash Line Coalition. Mobilized labor force, 4,200 units. Modified kinetic tools, 1,800 units. Heavy mining reroutes, 14 excavator chassis. "Cassian," Sabine called out from the primary elevator console. She had rewired the freight lift's safety governors, bypassing the palace's lockdown codes entirely. "We've got 14 heavy lifts operational. We can move 500 men every 8 minutes to the lower palace courtyards." "Move them now," Cassian ordered, his faceplate sliding back into place with a definitive snap. "The Vanguard's drop spores are already hitting the lower terrace. If we don't hold the secondary gates, the foundry shafts will become the swarm's primary highway into the planet's core." Before the first elevator could ascend, the massive brass atmospheric intake fan behind Jarek let out a terrifying grinding screech. The 6-ton steel blades, designed to pull air from the surface, suddenly bent backward, twisted like wire by a massive force from the upper shaft. A thick, putrid torrent of violet slime poured through the vents, followed by a sound that made every laborer freeze in place. It was the multi-layered, rhythmic clicking of thousands of chitinous legs scrambling down the interior of the ventilation pipes. The first spore had grown. The Vanguard had found the underbelly. Cassian racked the slide of his directorate sidearm, the weapon's power cell screaming as it filled with amber light. He stepped in front of the elevator gates, his massive iron frame shielding the workers behind him. "Jarek, get the first wave up to Sabine," Cassian roared over the rising din. "Hold the gates above. The deep belongs to the iron now." Chapter 5. The Siege of the White Terrace. Act 1. The Iron Ascent. The subterranean dark did not break into daylight. It exploded into a vertical meat grinder. As the heavy freight lift roared up the final kilometers of the palace shaft, the violet slime that had flooded the lower foundry lines began to rain down from the mesh ceiling. Cassian stood at the front of the cage, his gunmetal frame slick with a mixture of acidic biofluid and gray hydraulic oil. Chassis, structural integrity, 74%. Internal core, temp. Optimal. Ammunition, calibration, kinetic flanged. "The lift is breaching the surface gates," Sabine's voice crackled through the static-choked neural link, her words cut by the distant, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of high-pressure rivet guns. "Cassian, you need to clear the exit immediately. The swarm has built a hive wall right across the lower landing pad." "Hold the lift speed," Cassian rumbled back, his mechanical voice losing all remnants of his human scribe past. He leveled his blocky directorate sidearm, his three-fingered iron gauntlet locking onto the auxiliary stabilizer grip. "Jarek, prepare the torches." Behind him, 30 of the heaviest foundry laborers braced themselves against the iron walls of the cage. Their scrap iron boilerplates were bolted directly into their leather aprons, their eyes wide and bloodshot beneath their tinted welding visors. Crunch crack. The elevator didn't stop at the platform. It rammed directly through a 6-foot-thick ceiling barrier of calcified violet bone matter. The protective steel screen of the lift sheared away in a shower of white-hot friction sparks, exposing the squad to the freezing, sulfur-heavy gale of the White Terrace. The scene was an architectural nightmare turned slaughterhouse. The grand, miles-wide plaza of white marble, once the pristine promenade where the high prelates walked under golden silk umbrellas, was completely buried under a twitching 5-foot layer of organic purple tissue. Massive bulbous biospores had anchored themselves to the bases of the fluted columns, pulsing with a pale yellow light as they birthed the next wave of the Vanguard. "Out! Out!" Cassian roared, his iron boots crushing a pair of emerging chitinous mandibles as he lunged off the platform. He didn't fire. He used the sheer kinetic mass of his 900-pound body to plow a path through the wet, snapping mountain of biomonsters blocking the gate. To his left, Jarek and 3 other workers leaped from the cage, their dual-pronged slag cutters flaring with a blinding white heat. They swept the blades in wide, overlapping arcs, instantly vaporizing the purple tissue and filling the terrace with a thick, choking stench of caramelized organic fat. Act 2. The Defense of the Terrace Gate. The Coalition's line was a jagged, desperate arc of scrap iron and burning gas. Sabine had established a defensive perimeter around the Grand Sanctum Gatehouse, the main structural bottleneck leading into the inner palace layers where Lyra's transmission spire was located. 2,000 foundry workers had deployed along the white balustrades, using heavy mining excavators as improvised barricades. Audio cue. The sound of the battle is a chaotic industrial symphony, the high-pitched whine of pneumatic drivers, the wet, heavy thud of steel rivets punching through bone plates, and the continuous low-frequency roar of chemical flamethrowers clearing the perimeter. "They're coming from the columns!" Sabine screamed, her scattergun bucking violently as she blew the head off a multi-jointed biodrone that had dropped from a high marble archway. "Keep your spacing. Don't let them cluster." A wave of 50 lightweight scythe beasts tore across the plaza, their jagged limbs striking the white stone with a sound like 1,000 knives hitting an iron skillet. They didn't move like an army. They moved like a single liquid wave of hunger, guided by the psychic resonance of the transmission tower humming far above. "Hold!" Jarek bellowed, stepping into the gap between 2 excavator chassis. He jammed his slag cutter directly into the mouth of a leaping beast, the kinetic prongs melting the creature's jaws from the inside out before it could snap. "Give 'em the long steel." A row of 30 workers stepped forward in unison, leveling their modified pneumatic spike drivers. Chunko, chunko, chunko. The 6-inch steel rivets tore through the air at supersonic speeds. At close range, the heavy mining ammunition didn't just pierce the swarm's chitinous armor, it shattered it into jagged flying fragments of bone shrapnel that tore through the secondary lines of the beast wave behind them. But for every 100 monsters the workers pulverized, another 1,000 dropped from the bruised purple sky. The continent-sized hyperships of the Bleed were now visible through the shifting fog, their miles-wide maws dripping with yellow biofluid as they hovered just above the palace spires, casting a permanent, dark shadow over the entire capital system. Act 3. The Logic of the Shield. Cassian fought his way back to Sabine's side, his gunmetal armor blackened by fire and dripping with yellow acid. He looked up at the high transmission spire. The quicksilver light shooting from the pinnacle was beginning to flicker, its brilliant silver beam turning an unstable, stuttering blue. "The tower is losing synchronization," Cassian rumbled, his internal data links screaming with feedback from Lyra's core. "The psychic load is melting the primary copper conduits in the upper galleries. If the beam dies, the main fleet ships will drop directly onto our heads." "We can't go up there, Cassian," Sabine said, wiping a line of black grease from her visor as she slammed a fresh magazine into her scattergun. "The upper terrace is completely cut off. The Aurelian phalanx. What's left of them? They locked the high security gates from the inside. They're letting the lower city burn to buy their prelates 10 more minutes of prayer." Maros, the High Palatine, was crouching behind the command console of the gatehouse, his silk robes torn, his golden astrolabe shattered into useless brass cogs. His face was a mask of pure, unvarnished terror as he looked at the thousands of workers bleeding on his white stone floor. We must retreat to the inner sanctum," Maros whimpered, his fingers trembling as he reached for the manual lock switch of the main gatehouse. "The outer walls are compromised. The scripture says the pure must be preserved." Cassian didn't waste a breath. He reached out with his heavy iron gauntlet, grabbing the Palatine by the front of his crimson robes and lifting him 3 feet into the air. He slammed the aristocratic ruler against the iron bulkhead of the console. "There is no inner sanctum left, Maros," Cassian whispered, his amber visor flaring into a sudden, violent orange glare that reflected in the Palatine's eyes. "The scripture was written for an empire that had a wall. Look out there. Those are the men you left in the dark to choke, and they are the only thing standing between your throat and a bone scythe. Give me the master override key to the high gates." Maros stared at the titanium cables pulsing in Cassian's neck, then looked at the fierce, unyielding faces of the foundry miners who were currently dying to protect his palace. The old illusion of his golden authority dissolved into the red dark. He reached into his tunic, pulling out a heavy, multi-pronged silver key engraved with the crest of the first Orison. Cassian dropped him back to the deck, tossing the key to Sabine. "Take Jarek and 50 of the best torchmen," Cassian ordered, his hydraulic joints clicking as he reloaded his directorate sidearm for the final time. "Go up the maintenance tracks, clear the conduits, keep that tower alive no matter how many wires you have to weld with your bare hands." "What about you?" Sabine asked, her eyes softening for a fraction of a second behind her rebreather. Cassian turned back to face the open plaza, where the main landing wave of the bio fleet was currently hitting the marble stones with the sound of a world cracking in half. "I am the scribe," Cassian rumbled, his gunmetal frame locking into an immovable defensive stance at the center of the broken gatehouse. "I am going to finish the record." Chapter 6. The Epilogue of Iron. Act 1. The Crucible of the Spire. The high galleries of the Cathedral of the First Orison did not feel like a holy place anymore. They felt like the interior of an overheated engine. Sabine led the sprint up the winding stone stairs of the high tower, her boots splashing through pools of liquefied copper cladding that ran down the steps like glowing orange water. Behind her, Jarek and 30 surviving foundry miners dragged heavy cables and welding rigs, their breath coming in ragged, painful gasps through their scorched asbestos masks. "The conduits are splitting," Jarek yelled, gesturing with his slag cutter toward the massive, rib-like copper pillars that ran up the center of the spire. The pillars were weeping white-hot sparks. Under the immense psychic voltage Lyra was pulling through the planetary array, the ancient sovereignty wiring was literally dissolving, the insulation turning to black ash before it hit the floor. At the summit of the tower, suspended within the focus iris of the 1,000-foot broadcast dish, Lyra hung motionless. She was no longer a child, nor was she merely an asset. The quicksilver formatting fluid of the Matrix had completely consumed her flesh, turning her body into a brilliant, seamless statue of pure mirror metal. Her hair floated around her head in a cloud of fine silver wire, each strand vibrating at a frequency that turned the lashing sulfur rain into clouds of instantaneous steam. Broadcast cores, overload active. Neural matrix temperature, critical. Conduit threshold, 114% capacities. System, lifespan, 180 seconds. The line is breaking, Sabine. Lyra's harmonized voice didn't come through the air. It vibrated inside Sabine's skull, a cold, echoing chord that tasted of metal and blood. The thoughts of the fleet are too heavy. They are crushing the logic loops. "Hold on, kid," Sabine screamed, slamming the master silver key into the high gallery's control console. "Jarek, bridge the secondary cells. Weld the main bus bars directly to the generator tracks. Give her everything we've got left in the boilers." Jarek didn't hesitate. He stepped into the sparking gallery, his bare, tattooed torso instantly blistered by the immense radiant heat. He jammed the kinetic prongs of his heavy slag cutter across the broken gap of the main power line, using his own tool and the iron strength of his arms as a human circuit breaker. Jarek's green optical lens shatters from the glare, but his hands remain locked to the frame, his muscles freezing solid as the raw power of the planetary core surges through his metal tool and into the tower. The fading quicksilver beam shooting from Lyra's chest instantly stabilized, flaring into a brilliant, planet-wide shield of pure logic that forced the descending bio-dreadnoughts to halt their drop, their miles-wide maws burning as they hit the invisible silver ceiling. Act 2. The Last Scribe. Down on the white terrace, the world was a narrow circle of gray iron and purple blood. The gatehouse had fallen. The excavator barricades were nothing but burning, twisted heaps of scrap. Cassian stood alone at the base of the final marble archway leading to the cathedral stairs. His directorate armor was completely ruined. The left arm actuator had exploded, letting the limb hang uselessly by his side like a 300-pound slab of dead iron. His amber visor was gone, shattered by a bone scythe, leaving his single human eye to stare out through the smoke. Before him lay a mountain of the slain, hundreds of bio-monsters pulverized by his sidearm and his raw kinetic fury. But the swarm was endless. A fresh wave of 30 heavy armored Praetorian drones stepped over the carcasses, their yellow bioluminescent sacks pulsing with a hungry, vibrating anger. "Is the record clear?" Cassian rumbled over the short-range comms, his voice thick with the gray oil coughing up from his mechanical vocal vox. "The ships are away, Commander." Sabine's voice returned through the static, her tone no longer sharp but quiet, heavy with an absolute heartbreaking grief. The foundry lifts moved 300,000 citizens into the evacuation barges before the docks burned. "We're on the last shuttle now. We have Lyra." Cassian looked up through the violet fog at the small, slate-gray directorate transport rising from the cathedral's high landing pad. Its sublight engines flared with a clean, blue-white chemical fire as it rocketed toward the narrow gap Lyra's shield had torn in the orbital swarm. "Good," Cassian whispered. He dropped his empty sidearm, the heavy iron frame hitting the blood-soaked marble with a dull clatter. He reached down with his remaining right gauntlet, his 3 iron fingers locking onto the handle of Valen's fallen sunder hammer, which lay half-buried beneath the chitinous debris. The weapon's violet gravity core was entirely dead, but the weight remained. 900 pounds of cast iron, forged in the foundries of a dying empire. The leading Praetorian drone lunged, its 6-foot bone scythe whistling through the sulfur air toward Cassian's exposed throat. Cassian didn't step back. He didn't quote the liturgies. He didn't pray to the throne. He drew upon the final residual backup battery of his cybernetic heart, transferring every remaining watt of power into his right shoulder hydraulics. With a definitive animalistic roar, he swung the dead hammer upward in a brutal manual arc. Act 3, the Silver Sky. The evacuation transport cleared the atmosphere, its hull rattling violently as it punched through the burning perimeter of the sanctum wall. Inside the cockpit, Sabine kept her hands steady on the yokes, her eyes fixed on the navigation grid. Beside her, in the co-pilot's seat, Lyra sat perfectly still. The liquid silver circuits beneath her skin were fading now, cooling into a dull, permanent gray patina that looked like ancient lead. Her mercury eyes looked out at the vast cosmos ahead. "The Oros relay has gone dark," Sabine said softly, her voice flat in the quiet cabin. Behind them, the planet Oros did not explode. Under the final massive counter-signal Lyra had broadcast before leaving the tower, the planet's entire technological infrastructure had been completely neutralized. The golden lights of the cathedrals, the orbital defense networks, the planetary transmission grids, everything went completely, irrevocably dark. The lighthouse had been turned off. Without the psychic beacon of 40 billion minds to guide them, the continent-sized bio-dreadnoughts of the Bleed began to drift aimlessly in the vacuum, their massive, purple-veined hulls turning away from the dead system like blind predators that had lost the scent of blood. "They will find the next sector eventually," Sabine said, adjusting their vector toward the unexplored deep of the outer rim. "The core worlds are going to look for us. The Church will call us heretics. The Directorate will call us scrap." She looked back into the cargo hold, where the few dozen surviving foundry miners sat silently among the crates of scavenged tools, their pale faces illuminated by the dim, steady blue light of the ship's manual console. "Let them call us whatever they want," Lyra said. Her voice was no longer a dual-toned chord. The machine harmony had faded, leaving only the quiet, steady voice of a girl who had seen the edge of the world and survived it. "The old empire was built on a wall of gold, and it fell. The new line will be different." She raised her hand, her silver-laced fingers locking tight around the cold iron handle of a mining tool Jarek had left on the floor plates. "The next empire," Lyra whispered, looking out into the clean, unyielding black of the new frontier, "will be built of iron." The end.